There was a time when Beirut was called the Paris of the Middle East, a city of luxury hotels, overflowing banks, and some of the richest neighborhoods in the region. Today, that same city goes dark every night. People's savings have vanished behind locked bank doors, and an entire country is fighting to survive. So what happened to Lebanon? Most people who talk about Lebanon's collapse start in 1975 with the Civil War. That's the wrong starting point. To actually understand how this country broke, you have to go back much further, to a moment when Lebanon wasn't a Muslim-majority nation at all, when it was one of the most stubbornly, defiantly Christian corners of the entire Middle East. Understanding how that changed is the key to understanding everything that came after, including the economic implosion the world watched in real time a few years ago. This is the story of how a mountain full of Christian refugees built a nation, how that nation's religious foundation shifted underneath it for over 1,000 years, and how the financial system built on top of that shifting foundation eventually came crashing down into one of the worst peacetime collapses in modern history. Before Lebanon was Lebanon, it was Phoenicia, a strip of trading cities along the Mediterranean coast that had already survived Egyptian rule, Assyrian rule, Persian rule, and then Alexander the Great's brutal conquest in the 4th century BC. By the time Rome absorbed the region, the coastal cities were cosmopolitan, wealthy, and thoroughly pagan. Christianity arrived early and quietly, spreading north from Judea through fleeing believers after the persecution of the earliest church in Jerusalem. It did not arrive as a triumphant movement. For roughly 3 centuries, being a Christian in this part of the Roman world was closer to a death sentence than a religious identity. Believers were executed, tortured, and driven underground. It wasn't until the Roman Emperor Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century that Christianity flipped from persecuted minority to imperial religion. And even then, the new Christian empire spent the next century turning its violence on. The pagans who remained, and just as often on fellow Christians who disagreed about doctrine. Out of that chaos of schism and infighting came a hermit named Moran, living an ascetic life in the hills of Syria around the turn of the 5th century. He gathered followers through extreme self-denial, long fasts, harsh isolation, physical suffering as a form of devotion. And by the time he died, he had built a following that would outlast every empire that came after him. His disciples eventually reached the mountains of Lebanon, where a merchant named Abraham of Cyrus is credited with converting some of the last remaining pagan holdouts by paying off their crushing tax debts in exchange for loyalty to the new faith. This new Christian community, the Maronites, made a defining choice early in their existence. When the wider Christian world splintered after theological disputes in the 5th century, they stayed loyal to Rome. That loyalty came at a brutal cost. In 517 AD, hundreds of Maronite pilgrims were slaughtered by rival Christian factions in Syria, but the massacre worked in their favor. Politically, it forced the Pope to take notice, and within a year, the Maronite Church was formally recognized as an independent rite in full communion with Rome. By the early 7th century, Maronite Christianity stretched from Aleppo down through the Lebanese mountains to the coast. This was, by every meaningful measure, Christian territory. Then came Islam. In the early 600s, a merchant in Mecca named Muhammad began preaching a new monotheistic faith that would, within a single human lifetime, produce one of the fastest military expansions in recorded history. By 632, when Muhammad died, his successors were already at war, first consolidating the Arabian Peninsula and then pushing outward. Within a decade, Islamic armies had shattered the Persian Empire and stripped Byzantine Rome of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Lebanon, still a heavily Christian region under Byzantine control, fell into that same wave in the 630s. What followed wasn't an instant religious transformation. Conquest and conversion are different processes, and in Lebanon's case, they played out over centuries, not years. The new Islamic administrations didn't force mass conversion at the point of a sword. They didn't have anywhere near enough soldiers to police that kind of enforcement across an empire that would eventually stretch from Spain to India. Instead, they built a system of structured incentives. Christians and Jews were allowed to keep practicing their faith as people of the book, but they paid a special tax, the jizya, and were shut out of the top tiers of power, trade networks, and land ownership unless they converted. For a lot of people, especially the urban and commercial classes along the coast, conversion made practical sense. The Islamic world offered access to the era's best science, its most sophisticated administrative systems, and a trading network stretching further than anything Rome had ever managed. Refusing to convert meant permanent second-class status. So, generation by generation, city by city, the coastal population of Lebanon shifted. Arabic replaced Aramaic as the everyday language. Government posts, tax offices, and trade routes filled with converts. The pressure wasn't always violent, but it was constant, and it never let up. The Maronite Christians who refused to convert had one advantage nobody could easily take from them: geography. As pressure mounted along the coast and in the lowlands, They retreated upward into the rugged, difficult terrain of Mount Lebanon. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in the region's history. Persecuted groups surviving not because they won any argument or any war, but because they found terrain too inconvenient for empires to fully control. The mountains became a refuge, and for the next several centuries, the story of Lebanon is really the story of who held the coast and who held the mountain. By the time the Ottoman Empire absorbed the region in the 16th century, Lebanon wasn't a single religious bloc in either direction. It was a patchwork. Maronite Christians dominated large stretches of Mount Lebanon. The Druze, a smaller and famously secretive offshoot faith with roots in Islamic mysticism, controlled other mountain districts. Sunni Muslims dominated coastal port cities like Beirut, Tripoli, and Sidon. Shia Muslim communities took root in the south and in the Bekaa Valley to the east. Small Greek Orthodox, Greek Catholic, Armenian, and Jewish communities filled in the gaps. The Ottomans mostly let this patchwork run itself through local emirs and religious leaders, intervening only when it threatened wider imperial stability. That changed dramatically in 1860, when simmering tension between Maronite Christians and Druze, communities in Mount Lebanon exploded into open massacre. Thousands of Christians were killed in a matter of weeks. The violence was severe enough that France, which had long positioned itself as the protector of Ottoman Christians, intervened directly, sending troops and forcing the Ottomans to create a special autonomous Christian majority governorate in Mount Lebanon under European guarantee. That intervention set a precedent that would define the next century. Lebanon's Christians increasingly looked to Europe, and specifically France, as their patron and protector. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed after the First World War, France took direct control of the region under a League of Nations mandate, and in 1920 it drew the borders of what we now call Lebanon deliberately, expanding the old Christian majority mountain governorate to include Beirut, the fertile Bekaa Valley, and the largely Muslim coastal cities to the north and south. The goal was explicit: create a state large enough to be economically viable, with a Christian population large enough to dominate it politically under permanent French patronage. It was a decision made by a colonial power for the benefit of one community, with barely a passing thought for how the other, communities folded into this new country, might feel about their new political ceiling. That decision is the seed of almost everything that came later. When Lebanon declared independence from France in 1943, its founding leaders faced an immediate, unavoidable problem. How do you build a functioning government across a population split between Christians, Sunnis, Shia, and Druze, all of whom had spent generations distrusting each other and some of whom had been actively massacring each other within living memory? Their answer was the National Pact, an unwritten but rigorously enforced political agreement. The presidency would always go to a Maronite Christian. The prime minister's office would always go to a Sunni Muslim. The speaker of parliament would always go to a Shia Muslim. Seats in parliament, cabinet posts, even senior military positions were divided along a fixed ratio between Christians and Muslims. That ratio was based on Lebanon's only formal census, conducted in 1932, which showed a slim Christian majority of roughly 53%. It was an elegant solution to an urgent problem, and for a couple of decades it actually worked. But it was built on a fatal assumption that the demographic snapshot of 1932 would hold steady forever. It didn't. Muslim birth rates, particularly in Shia communities in the south and the Bekaa, ran roughly double the Christian rate through the 1950s and 60s. At the same time, well-educated, well-connected Christians began emigrating to Europe and the Americas in large numbers, chasing opportunity abroad. And then came the refugees. After Israel's founding in 1948, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled into neighboring countries, and a large share ended up in Lebanon, settled into camps, denied citizenship, and, after the Palestine Liberation Organization relocated its leadership to Beirut in 1970, increasingly armed and operating outside the Lebanese government's control entirely. By the early 1970s, the mathematical foundation of the National Pact had already quietly collapsed. The government just hadn't caught up to that fact yet. A political system built to freeze a single religious ratio in time cannot survive contact with a population that refuses to stay frozen. Something had to give. Before the cracks fully split the country open, Lebanon had its moment in the sun, and it's worth pausing on just how remarkable that moment actually was. In the 1950s and 60s, Beirut functioned as the financial capital of the entire Arab world. A 1956 banking secrecy law, modeled loosely on Switzerland's, turned the city into the destination of choice for wealthy Gulf Arabs looking to park their money somewhere stable and discreet. International banks set up regional headquarters there by the dozen. Tourism topped 2 million visitors a year in a country of roughly 2.5 million people. The American University of Beirut drew students from 60 different countries. GDP per capita in the 1960s actually outpaced oil-rich Saudi Arabia. Beirut had casinos, jazz clubs, and a nightlife scene that genuinely competed with Paris. It was also, crucially, the one Arab capital where censorship was loose enough that writers, filmmakers, and dissident intellectuals from across the region gathered to work freely. It was cosmopolitan in a way that felt almost impossible, given everything simmering underneath it. And that's exactly the tragedy of it. The Golden Age and the coming collapse were happening at the same time, on the same streets, and almost nobody wanted to look directly at the second one. In April of 1975, the pressure that had been building for 2 decades finally broke. What followed over the next 15 years wasn't a single civil war, so much as a dozen overlapping ones, fought along shifting and often surprising lines. Christian militias fought each other as often as they fought Muslim factions. Shia militias fought each other. The PLO and the Syrian army, nominally on the same side, fought each other too. Syria invaded in 1976 under the pretense of restoring order and didn't leave for 29 years. Israel invaded in 1978 and again in 1982, pushing all the way to Beirut and splitting the city in half along a front line that turned its once glamorous downtown into a sniper's alley. The human cost was staggering. Roughly 120,000 people were killed, another 150,000 wounded, and over 1 million displaced out of a population of 2.5 million. Entire communities were driven from neighborhoods they'd lived in for generations. The Christian population of southern Mount Lebanon, once the overwhelming majority of the area, collapsed to a small fraction of its former size within a decade. Lebanon's ancient Jewish community, thousands strong, was almost entirely gone by the time the fighting ended in 1990. When a peace agreement was finally brokered in the Saudi city of Taif in 1989, it rebalanced the old national pact, shifting more power toward the Sunni prime minister and away from the Maronite presidency, acknowledging on paper what the demographics had already made obvious in practice. But peace agreements don't distribute power to good intentions. They distribute it to whoever has the biggest army left standing when the shooting stops. In this case, that was Syria, whose troops remained embedded throughout Lebanon for nearly 3 decades, and Iran, which had spent the war years quietly building an entirely new Shia militia from scratch in the Bekaa Valley. They called it Hezbollah, and unlike every other militia in the country, it never disarmed. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Lebanon looked from a distance like a country healing. Beirut's downtown was rebuilt with gleaming new towers and rooftop bars. Tourism returned. Real estate prices in the capital began rivaling those in London. Underneath that shiny surface, though, the same warlords who had run the militias during the war were now running government, ministries, and they were getting rich together across sectarian lines. Reconstruction contracts flowed to companies owned by the same politicians, approving them. Basic infrastructure, electricity, water, phone lines, was never properly rebuilt because there was no incentive to fix a system that made so much money staying broken. Lebanon has had rolling blackouts since the 1990s that never really stopped. Meanwhile, Hezbollah kept growing into something closer to a parallel state than a political party. It ran its own hospitals, schools, media network, and welfare system throughout southern Lebanon and Beirut's southern suburbs, and it kept accumulating weapons, tens of thousands of rockets by the early 2000s, funded by a steady stream of Iranian money. By the 2020s, it held enough seats in parliament to veto any government it didn't like. While operating an armed force, the actual Lebanese state had no power to control. Here is the part that connects the religious history to the economic collapse everyone remembers from the headlines. The same fractured, patronage-driven political system that emerged from 1,000 years of shifting religious balance also produced a financial system with almost no real accountability behind it. In 1997, Lebanon's central bank pegged the national currency to the US dollar and held that peg for over 2 decades. To defend it, banks needed a constant growing supply of actual dollars flowing into the country, so they offered depositors extraordinary interest. Rates, sometimes 15, 20, even 30%, to attract money from the Lebanese diaspora and Gulf investors. It worked for a while because the dollars kept arriving. But the mechanism underneath it was, by the International Monetary Fund's own later description, essentially a pyramid scheme. New deposits were used to pay the interest owed on older deposits, which required an ever-growing pipeline of fresh money just to stay solvent. By 2019, the banking sector had accumulated tens of billions of dollars in losses, and public debt had ballooned past 170% of GDP, almost all of it in foreign currency the country simply didn't have. The whole structure depended on remittances and deposits continuing to flow in faster than they flowed out. The moment that reversed, the system had nowhere left to go but down. The trigger, when it finally came in October of 2019, was almost absurdly small: a proposed tax on WhatsApp calls. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of people were in the streets. Within days, the banks shut their doors. When they reopened, they quietly stopped letting depositors withdraw their own dollars, capping monthly withdrawals and paying out in a rapidly collapsing local currency instead of the dollars people had actually deposited. A currency that had held steady against the dollar for over 20 years lost roughly 98% of its value within a few years. People who had spent a lifetime building comfortable retirements woke up poor almost overnight. The World Bank would later describe it as one of the most severe economic collapses anywhere in the world since the mid-1800s. Poverty roughly tripled in a decade. Pharmacies ran out of medicine, hospitals ran out of fuel, hundreds of thousands of Lebanon's most skilled professionals, doctors, engineers, scientists, left the country entirely. Then, less than a year later, on October 4th of 2020, roughly 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate that had been sitting improperly stored in Beirut's port for 6 years, despite repeated written warnings to government officials, detonated in one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in recorded history. Over 200 people were killed, thousands wounded, and half of Beirut's urban area damaged in a single instant. It took more than 5 years for any formal indictments to come out of the investigation, a delay that, on its own, tells you almost everything you need to know about how functional the Lebanese state actually was by that point. The last several years have added an entirely new layer of conflict on top of the economic devastation. In October of 2023, Hezbollah opened a front against Israel in solidarity with Hamas, dragging Lebanon into a war its own government had no say in starting. What began as a low-intensity exchange escalated dramatically through 2024, when Israeli intelligence detonated explosives hidden inside pagers and radios used by Hezbollah operatives, followed by airstrikes that killed the group's longtime leader and much of its senior command within weeks. By the time a ceasefire took hold in late November of 2024, thousands of Hezbollah fighters were dead, and roughly a quarter of Lebanon's population had been displaced. Then, in December of 2024, the Assad government in Syria collapsed, severing Hezbollah's overland supply route from Iran. In January of 2025, for the first time in over 2 years, Lebanon's parliament actually managed to elect a president and a prime minister, neither of them tied to the old warlord networks that had run the country since the Civil War. It looked, briefly, like an opening. But renewed strikes in early 2026 showed just how fragile that opening still is, and a ceasefire reached in the spring of 2026 remains exactly that, fragile. Trace the line all the way back, and the shape of it becomes hard to miss. A Christian community that survived centuries of persecution by retreating into an unforgiving mountain range. A slow, incentive-driven religious transformation that took most of the surrounding region from Christian to Muslim over the span of centuries, without ever fully erasing the mountain holdouts. A colonial border drawn specifically to preserve a Christian political majority that was already mathematically doomed the moment it was drawn. A power-sharing agreement frozen to a single census that stopped reflecting reality within a generation. A civil war that let outside. Powers walk in and never fully leave. An elite class that learned to profit from a broken state rather than fix it. And a financial system that turned all of that accumulated dysfunction into an actual literal pyramid scheme that eventually had nowhere left to run. Lebanon didn't go from rich to ruin because of one bad decision or one unlucky year. It went from rich to ruin because a religious and political balance struck under completely different circumstances over 1,000 years ago kept getting patched instead of rebuilt, right up until the day there was nothing left to patch.